And again, the Lord God hath commanded that men should not murder, that they should not lie, that they should not steal, that they should not take the Lord of their God in vain. We sort of skipped on fucking 14-year-olds, though, that they should not envy, that they should not have malice, that they should not have contented one with another, that they should not commit whoredoms, and that they should do none of these things, for whoso doeth them shall perish, except for that one guy.
All of which they all did, right? Like
Right, Joseph hit all of these.
Literally, like
Brigham
I
Young.
could spend an entire 2-hour block of this show just going one by one and providing citations of every single time Joseph Smith did one of those things.
Yeah.
What are we on, 7?
7? I think that's right. Something like that. I mean, I don't have these numbered. I just have them bolded in my notes here. But this one is they should not contend one with another.
We'll ask what that means in just a moment. But I mean, the first question is, are these commandments? What the hell is this?
Sort of. I mean, it's like a boiling down, a distillation of the 10 Commandments with a couple of others thrown in there just for the hell of it. So, well, I think we're going to talk about the 2 that we have to maybe talk about right now ahead of us in this record. Might just be the most controversial of all of them, and especially the final one, because that's the thou shalt not commit whoredoms. And I mean, come on. But for now, let's talk about contending one with another, because this is something that I find endlessly fascinating in the church. Because in the modern Mormon culture, we have a leadership structure as the church exists right now. We have the presidency at the top, well, the prophet at the top of the presidency, then his 2 counselors, and then we have the quorum of apostles underneath that, and then the quorums of 70s underneath that. Picture it in a building that might, have a pointy top and be broader at the edge. And one might call it like a pyramid or something like that. So this pyramid-like structure of this business has
or scheme.
I synonymous at this point, right? But then below that we have all of the regional representatives, and then below that we have stake presidents, and then below that we have bishops and branch presidents, which bishops is like like an individual church, all of the individual ward houses. So it has this very bottom heavy leadership structure, and only the top crust are paid for it. But what is interesting to me is the restored gospel that Joseph Smith created didn't have this leadership structure. This leadership structure evolved as Joseph Smith's needs evolved in the church. And those needs, of course, were that he needs to have more authority than everybody else. He needs to be seen as the only person who can speak as the prophet of God. So each individual time we see the implementation of a new leadership structure in the church, we can trace that to a power struggle with Joseph Smith and some of his leaders. And one of the earliest ones of these comes in the form of Hiram Page. And Hiram Page is actually very interesting. He's one of the people who signed his name as an 8 witness, one of the 8 witnesses in the Book of Mormon. He was a relative to Joseph Smith through like extended marriage. But in any case, within the first month of the church starting, this church of Christ that Joseph started was very much motivated on the idea that Zion, the New Jerusalem, would be built upon the American continent. That's in one of the articles of faith of the church. And the people who joined Joseph's church were, it's not Zionist in the sense of like Israelite Zionists, but these are Zionitic Christians who believe in a Zion restored gospel and a Zionic type of theocracy. And Joseph Smith said that Zion is here in America, but people wanted to know where Zion is. And it wasn't until a couple years into his ministry that he finally declared Zion is actually in Jackson County, Missouri. And of course, that spawned a lot of the troubles with, that becoming the Mormons' chosen land, and the non-Mormon Missourians being like, no, that's our land. We bought this. Fuck you. So Hiram Page was one of the early leaders of the church, one of the elders, and he gave a revelation on the location of Zion. And we don't have the revelation because when Joseph Smith caught wind that Hiram Page had given a revelation declaring where Zion is, he told his crony, Oliver Cowdery, to go confront Hiram Page about it. And the end result of this was that Hiram Page's revelation was declared as heresy, and it was burned. And the seer stone that he used, just the way that Joseph Smith did, his head in a hat with the magic shining rock, Joseph was so damn petty about this that he had Hiram Page's seer stone ground into dust and scattered in the wind. That's a very early story of Joseph contending with his fellow leadership.
And it's still just a rock.
At the end of the day, it's a fucking rock in a hat.
Okay.
So
I was wondering what contend means. So I mean, this is not the way we speak today. So there was a couple of different options. So contest would be another way that we would put that. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I think contend can take on kind of an umbrella modern interpretation. Contend, if you're being contentious with somebody, you're being aggressive, you're being argumentative, and modern day Mormons, Christians would contend that that scripture to be like, don't fight with one another. That's all right, but that's the way that I'm interpreting it, at least for the purposes of how we're using this scripture to examine the life and times of Joseph Smith, because he was constantly contending with his fellow leaders. He was constantly embroiled and battling against them to retain total sole control over his church that he created. This caused all sorts of power struggles, and this caused the Whitmers and Oliver Cowdery to get excommunicated, and then the Danite Manifesto was written saying that we're going to kill you. So there were some very interesting individual times when there was a huge existential threat to the church, and Joseph Smith did something, and he manufactured a new office of the church that put people into a place of authority. Now, one of the best examples we have of this is Zion's Camp. Now, Zion's Camp was Joseph Smith's first military campaign. And what had happened was, just like we talked about in, I think, the last episode or the one before that, the Missourians didn't like the Mormons homesteading in the state of Missouri. And the Mormons had essentially 2 years to begin turning a profit off of their land in order to gain a deed to the land that they had just settled on, squatted on, really. Well, when the Missourians did that, the Missourians resorted to violence to kick the Mormons off of their land in Jackson County, and they removed the Mormons from Jackson County. And it was understood that the Mormons had rightful claim to this land because they were using the government program, the government homesteading program. But so the Mormons saw that this was their land, but the Missourians saw it as, this is our land. You are the foreigners, get the fuck out. So they kicked the Mormons out of Jackson County, and the Mormons lost their homes. They lost all their supplies. The few people were beaten. Some folks were tarred and feathered. It was a pretty ugly type of mob riot situation. Well, they lost all their things, and Joseph Smith said that he would go and redeem Zion, which meant that he was going to go and essentially commit war against Jackson County in order to regain the land that had been stolen from the Mormons by the anti-Mormon Missourians. So he asked for 1,000 volunteers to march 1,000 miles across the plains to go restore Zion. And 200 people showed up. But in any case, he made the march. It was an ill-fated march. He never actually committed war against anybody, and he just exacerbated the tensions, and everything turned out to be a complete and fantastic failure. And many of the people who participated in Zion's Camp were the leadership of the church. They were very disenchanted with Joseph Smith's leadership decisions, especially because at the end of the day, this military march, they marched 1,000 miles across the plains, arrived in Missouri, and basically camped out, and all of them caught cholera, and 12 of them died, and then they went home. They didn't accomplish anything except killing some Mormons with cholera. So the people who participated in this returned home to Ohio under Joseph's leadership and were incensed at what a failure this was and how God's revelation failed. Joseph Smith said that he is going to redeem Zion. He called for a military campaign, and then they just left. Nothing happened. So what Joseph Smith did is he created his quorum of apostles and his quorums of 70s. And that essentially created the middle management structure of the church. And this was an extremely contentious time. But basically what he did was he gave a consolation prize to all of the participants in Zion's camp and said, yes, sure, we didn't redeem Zion like that revelation, thus saith the Lord, said we would, but at least what you get is some kind of a managerial position in the church. And that served to be the formation of the Quorum of Apostles and the Quorums of the 70s.
How
All
does
from
that
his failed military
justify
campaign.
that God said this would happen, and then it didn't? And you're the prophet, and you're admitting that it didn't. You're not even trying to spin it to say that, well, it happened, but it only happened spiritually. No, you're just admitting that it didn't happen at all. How are people just still attached to this?
It doesn't click with me. I don't get it, but like I also understand the power of a sunk cost fallacy, because these soldiers that Joseph Smith conscripted from the Mormons, they marched 1,000 miles. They were shoulder to shoulder with their brothers in arms, and they were singing hymns and chanting, battle hymns along the way. They were they were led by a righteous prophet. The Lord had not only spoken to the prophets of old and, brought his savior down here to sacrifice himself for us, but now the Lord is speaking to a prophet in our age. These must truly be the last days. So they invest their personal time, their personal wealth, their personal beliefs into following this guy. And then it turns out to be a gigantic failure. Zion's camp was. A lot of people don't want to admit that they're wrong and that they looked really stupid for the past 4 years of their life following this guy.
One of my earliest memories, I have this fleeting memory of running up and down a stairway at maybe 3 years old with a bunch of other kids.
Mm-hmm.
And my parents filled me in on when and where this was. These were some neighbors when we lived in Alaska. My family lived in the bush, and they ran a logging company. We lived on a raft in this bay, but there was some other people we knew that had a conventional house, and so we went to go visit them at some point. And I don't know what kind of a cult thing they were, whether they Jehovah's Witnesses or whatever the hell they were, but these people that had this 2-story house with the stairway in it, and they had a shit ton of kids. They just had way too many kids for one family.
Yeah.
And the guy, they refused to mow their lawn. They refused to do any maintenance on the house because there's no point in mowing the lawn.
The second coming.
Because Jesus is coming back real soon.
Yeah.
So let's have a bunch of kids. A shit ton of kids. Let's just have a whole bunch of kids. But not do anything responsible, because the world is about to end. And mind you, this is maybe 1965.
Did it end soon after?
Just to catch you up, no.
Well, Woodstock was soon after, so the world ended for a lot of people then, right? But like, I mean, in essence, that is such an abdication of the social contract that we all have as being part of this social human species, right? If you think that if you are lazy enough to think that I don't have to do anything because Jesus is going to come back and burn all the believers and everything, then A, you're being lazy, and B, you are being misanthropic. You are being an anti-human in that regard, because you are saying it doesn't matter. The world doesn't matter. All my duty is to multiply and shit out a bunch of kids so that I can raise a righteous generation, and the believers, my family, will outnumber all of the unbelievers who are going to get burned in the last days. So fuck all my responsibilities. Fuck taking care of the planet. fuck trying to help my neighbor in need because Jesus is coming soon. It's a lazy way to abdicate responsibility to the social contract.
Yeah. And that's what I always saw Christianity as, just all flavors of it. It is a denial of responsibility. You don't have to do anything to help anybody. You can just literally wish upon a star that they'll get the help that they need without you having to do a damn thing.
Yeah.
You don't have to serve. You don't have to make anything right that you've done wrong. You don't even have to do time for it. All you have to do is declare that your magic imaginary friend has forgiven you for whatever you've done. And so the court system is just supposed to respect that. And you don't have to do anything to take care of the planet either, because it doesn't matter what a horrible mess this planet looks like when Jesus doesn't show up.
Right.
Because you're just never going to admit that you're wrong, ever. Because that's what faith means, never admitting when you're always wrong.
Yeah. That really is the essence of it. And people will go to extreme lengths to cling to their wrongness. And in the case of like the early Mormons, they suffered on just incredible amounts of personal anguish and turmoil because they were so committed to the idea that what they were experiencing was because they were God's chosen people, and this is persecution. And of course, Joseph Smith was happy to sell them that narrative.
Yeah.
So yeah, there are plenty of examples of Joseph Smith fighting with his leaders and him evolving the leadership structure of the church in order to continue to place himself higher and higher on the pyramid structure. And that's all well and good, but I think that there's also contending with your neighbor, right? Because it's like, love thy neighbor as thyself, Jesus said, supposedly. So contending with people who are non-Mormons was one of the Mormons' favorite pastimes. At least it was Joseph Smith's. And, you know, we talked about the Missouri-Mormon War quite a bit, but what's interesting about the Missouri-Mormon War is Governor Boggs, in dealing with the Mormons there, he created a playbook and essentially chronicled his mistakes as he went along, and not a literal, playbook, but other leaders in government structures were able to view what Lilburn Boggs did right and wrong in dealing with the Mormons, and they used that information to deal with the problem better later on. So in 1844, Joseph Smith is known as Lieutenant General Joseph Smith, and people would refer to him by different titles based on what their office was. So if it was one of his closest acolytes, they would call him Brother Joseph. If it was one of the people in some kind of a leadership structure, they would call him, President or Prophet. If he was somebody in his military capacity, they would refer to him as general. And by and large, people outside of the church refer to Joseph Smith as General Joseph Smith. And he commanded a massive private military, massive. And, I stated in, one of the previous episodes that it was larger than basically any state militia could summon at any time. And this was a militia that was centered in a single city. So that's very dangerous, especially for somebody who had committed treason and gone to open warfare against a state previously and had escaped justice. He didn't serve his time after the Missouri-Mormon War. He escaped from prison. So Joseph Smith, as a fugitive living in Illinois from Missouri, built his own militia again, continued to use the Danites, his shadow militia, and continued to amass wealth and political power, and continued to connect with other powerful individuals. And this is something that was very dangerous because he hadn't changed any of his practices from Missouri. He had just become more sophisticated at his practices, which means a lot more danger is on the horizon for this. At what point does he cross the precipice and become unstoppable? That's really the question here. At what point does Joseph Smith become unstoppable? So the Mormons exercised an extreme amount of political influence because they voted as a bloc. Now, there were, at the time, there were, the Democrat parties. The Democrats were the Southerners. They were the slaveholders. And then the other largest party were the Whigs. And the Whigs, they had coming and going political power at various points, but they were falling out of favor by the time Joseph Smith was late in his ministry. But the Mormons didn't vote on issues. They voted for people who would treat the Mormons well. And when we say that, of course, that was, from Joseph Smith's sermons, that he would declare that this person is a good person or that person is a Missourian. And the Mormons would vote according to what Joseph Smith declared would be the person who would help the Mormons the most. And most often that meant turning the other way when the Mormons were conducting criminal activity. So Thomas Ford was the governor of Illinois during 1844, and a town just south of Nauvoo was known as Warsaw. There are basically two cities nearby. There was Warsaw, Illinois, and Carthage, Illinois. And these cities were basically hotbeds of anti-Mormonism because they were the next door neighbors to the Mormons. They dealt with the Mormons on a day-to-day basis and hated them. And when people would flee the Mormon Empire because they were afraid the Danites would come knocking, they could seek refuge in Warsaw and in Carthage from the Mormons. So birth out of these two cities were the anti-Mormons. The anti-Mormon was an organized, formal political party that was organized for the sole purpose of combating the military and political power of Joseph Smith.
Wow.
And
political party.
A political
calling
party.
Themselves the anti-Mormons.
That's correct. Yes. And they had a circular. There was an editor named Thomas Sharp who published the Warsaw Signal, and he very quickly began covering the Mormons when they first started arriving in early 1839 in Quincy, Illinois, as refugees. And he had a lot of sympathy for them. He a lot of Illinoisans had sympathy for the Mormons because they had just been chased out by those rapscallion Democrat slave owners in Missouri, and Illinois was a progressive state by and large. So and
for anyone listening, Democrat meant something very different back then.
yeah. Like I said, Democrats were the slaveholders, and Abraham Lincoln formed the Republican Party that emancipated the slaves, right? So the paradigms shift
in the
over
1960s, the Republican Party and the Democrat Party, through what was called the Southern Strategy, over the course of 8 years or so, effectively switched positions on a whole lot of policies.
Yes, absolutely right. Yep, that's only
so that every Klansman. To be sure that the Democratic Party was started by there were several members of the KKK at the beginning of the Democratic Party, but every Klansman is a Republican now.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and I mean, Democrat Party got its moniker of the jackass because of Andrew Jackson, because he was a stubborn, bullheaded jackass, and he was a country bumpkin and coming in as a populist leader to try and throw off, or to try and retake, or to try and take control of the government away from the elite Northerners who had been running the country since, for the 6 presidencies before him. So Andrew Jackson comes along as a populist, as a, he's a military leader. He's old hickory, he's a rough and tumble populist leader. And he gained the moniker of a jackass for that. So, he was a slave owner too, right? So, he was a fucking monster. So, yes, paradigms shift over time. The labels of political parties that we use now do not very well apply to the parties back then. In any case, the Mormons voted as a bloc, and Joseph Smith had a massive private militia. So therefore, Thomas Sharp and a few others who had been noticing the growing power of Joseph Smith formed the anti-Mormon political party. And I am of the opinion that there needs to be an anti-Mormon political party, again, because the Mormon church is so politically powerful in Utah specifically, but also much larger. In any case, the anti-Mormons essentially, when Joseph Smith burned the printing press for the Nauvoo Expositor, which the Nauvoo Expositor was a paper that was started by his leadership that spawned off and created a new church against Joseph. they published this Nauvoo Expositor that was just an expose of Joseph Smith's polygamy and his military campaign and his presidential campaign and all of the problems and the corruption in Nauvoo. Joseph Smith said, no, we can't have that in our city, and he burned their printing press. And as a result of that, the anti-Mormon political party called for war. And they called for all of the state militias to gather in Warsaw and Carthage and organize to conduct a military raid on the Nauvoo Mormon settlement. Governor Ford...
Now, these are all Illinois towns. Nauvoo, Carthage.
Correct. That's correct. Yep, absolutely. So Governor Thomas Ford, who was, in my opinion, a pragmatist and was very delicate with matters, but he had to handle a situation that no human being could handle. And the result of this is that Thomas Ford recognized the problems that Lilburn Boggs had struggled with the Mormons in the Missouri Mormon War. And he said, I'm not going to repeat Lilburn Boggs' mistakes. So he went down to Nauvoo and to Carthage, the governor of the state, and personally met with the leaders of the anti-Mormon parties and with Joseph Smith on numerous occasions, and ended up convincing Joseph Smith to surrender himself for arrest. And this led to Joseph Smith going to Carthage jail and being shot. But in any case, what happened was Governor Ford being there de-escalated the tensions and eliminated the possibility of a Missouri Mormon War. Of an Illinois Mormon War. He learned how contentious the Mormons were, and he said, not in my state. I'm not going to let that happen here. And he handled it in an interesting way and in a delicate way, and he even provided his own report of how he handled it to Congress after Joseph Smith was assassinated and some criminal filings had been heard against some of the supposed assassins. And he wrote all of his congressional report and findings into a book called A History of Illinois by Thomas Ford, 1854 publication, I want to say. And it's a fascinating read because we get to see the mindset of a governor who is dealing with his state teetering on civil war and how he was able to rein in both parties and diffuse the tensions. It's a remarkable, remarkable situation. But the primary reason that the Illinois Mormon War never happened was because of vigilante justice. Joseph Smith, the aggressor in all of this, the contentious person, was shot. He died. He was no longer a factor that could escalate the tensions.